right, welcome back to Focal Point AF. Our talk. Brian Fisher is my name. Start you off with a little factoid. I want to jump into the discussion of science and creationism. Got a point I want to make, and I want to illustrate it. But did you know, if you were to believe the liberal media, and you think back on the last 7 mass shootings, and your source of information, your perspective about our culture and who the real dangers in our culture are to life, limb, who would you think would be responsible for the last 7 mass shootings? If you listened to the mainstream media and believed what they said, if you listened to Janet Napolitano, if you listened to Barack Obama and believed what they said about who the real threats are to safety and security and who do you think would be behind the last 7 mass shootings? Well, you would say certainly it'd be some crazed right-winger, some Tea Party nut job, some veteran who's just returned home with post-traumatic stress disorder, who's a member of the Tea Party, and just goes off and starts shooting up people. Well, here are the last 7 mass shootings now, and here is their political affiliation. Fort Hood, 2009. The guy that did that was a registered Democrat, Hassan, and a Muslim jihadist, but he was a registered Democrat. He was a left-wing liberal. Columbine. Now, these guys were too young to vote, but their families, they both came from families filled with registered Democrats and progressive liberals. Virginia Tech. Remember, that's where he drove through a crowd, 32 people and all that, and shot people in classrooms. The guy that was the shooter there, he wrote hate mail to President Bush and to his staff. Colorado Theater, the Aurora shooting. He was a registered Democrat. He was a staff worker on the Obama campaign. He was a participant in Occupy Wall Street. He was, in other words, a progressive liberal. Connecticut school shooter. He was a registered Democrat, and he hated Christians. Tucson. Jared Loughner was a registered independent. He hated President Bush. He loved abortion. He was angry with Gabby Giffords for not having done enough against Bush. That's what set him off. She hadn't done enough to stop Bush. Naval base mass shooting. Aaron Alexis was a liberal who was happy with Obama. So guns don't kill the masses. Left-wing liberals kill the masses. That is the takeaway from all of that. Now, I'm looking at a piece here, Why Creationists Can't Be Scientists. That's the title of the piece, Why Creationists Can't Be Scientists. It's in Salon.com, Salon magazine, written by a guy named Sean McElwee. And his argument is that creationism is far from harmless. It's a real threat to scientific inquiry. That is the title of his piece. So he's saying it's impossible to be both a creationist and to be a good scientist because creationism is a threat, a positive threat, he says, to inquiry, to scientific inquiry. And he says if you espouse creationism, you are precluding the practice of science. Now, I came across a quote some time ago from an evolutionary scientist. I just had a few minutes to look for the quote this morning and couldn't find it. I'll bring it to you as soon as I can track it down. But he's an evolutionist, complete believer in Darwin and evolutionary biology and evolutionary origins and the whole bit. And he was asked, and this was more in the context of a debate about intelligent design. He said, is there any part of the scientific work that you do, and I don't remember exactly what his discipline was, but it was a scientific endeavor, and he was one of the leading scientists in that particular field. Is there anything that you do in your scientific pursuits that would be hampered, would be hindered, would be blocked or stopped if evolution was not true? In other words, how dependent are you on doing genuine scientific research? How dependent are you on believing in the theory of evolution? And he says it's irrelevant to what I do. Whether evolution is true or not makes absolutely no difference to the kind of science that I practice. It's irrelevant. Evolution is all about origins, about the development of life. So maybe it affects in some kind of tangential way people that work in those areas, archaeology or biology maybe in some degree. But the work I do, whether intelligent design or evolution is true, is absolutely irrelevant. Now, the way I want to respond to this argument that it's impossible to be a good scientist and a creationist is to use an argument from history to show what a miserably bankrupt argument this is. Now, you hear this all the time. Bill Nye was implying that. He was very condescending toward Ken Ham. Those of us on the outside, I don't know if you remember that movie, The Village. Now, I never saw that movie. It came out a few years ago about all these people living in this like 18th century village. And they didn't realize until somebody made a break for it that there was an entire world. It was actually a contemporary setting. It was a contemporary world. And these people were living in this 18th century village and had no idea that larger world was even out there. And that's kind of what Bill Nye was trying to evoke. You people are huddled in this little 17th century Puritan village. There's an entire world out there that you are oblivious to. And so that's the meme that the media wants to paint. If you believe in creation science, if you believe in origins, if you believe what the Bible says about origins, you cannot be a good scientist. You are disqualified from scientific inquiry. Remember, we saw yesterday, I brought you the results of that poll. 2 million out of the 12 million scientists in America, 2 million of them are self-identified evangelicals. So clearly, at least for them, and these are all credentialed scientists, no conflict between their evangelical theology and their work on science. Now, the point I want to make here is very simple, is it is impossible for there to be a conflict between good theology and good science. It's impossible because God is the author of both. You cannot, it is impossible to have a conflict between good science and good theology. Now, you can have a conflict between good theology and bad science. You can have a conflict between bad theology and good science, but you cannot. It is impossible to have a conflict between good theology and good science. So if somebody is manufacturing some kind of conflict or telling you that there's a conflict, then there is something wrong either with the theology or there is something wrong with the science. Now, to deal with this issue of whether it is possible to be a good scientist and a creationist, I just want to explore with you briefly the history of scientific disciplines. I'm going to get into a couple of specific individuals here in just a moment, names that you'll be familiar with. But I want to just trace through with you this isn't even all of them. I'm looking at a list that goes 3 pages from a book called Men of Science, Men of God by Henry Morris. And it lists the scientific disciplines that were established by Bible-believing scientists. In other words, all of these major scientific disciplines were established, the pioneers in these areas of scientific inquiry, scientific disciplines, were in every case Bible-believing scientists. You talk about antiseptic surgery. That would be Joseph Lister, gave his name to Listerine. He was a Bible-believing scientist. Bacteriology, founded by Louis Pasteur. Pasteurized milk and all the business of sterilization and that stuff. That was Louis Pasteur. Vaccinations. He was one of the major developers of vaccines. Bacteriology. Louis Pasteur, Bible-believing scientist. Calculus, founded by Isaac Newton, a Bible-believing scientist. It's also the gravity guy. Celestial mechanics, founded by Johannes Kepler, who said, I'm thinking God's thoughts after. When I look at the stars, I look at the universe, I am thinking God's thoughts after him. The field of chemistry, founded by Robert Boyle, a Bible-believing scientist. Comparative anatomy, founded by Georges Cuvier, a Bible-believing scientist. Computer science, founded by Charles Babbage. He's considered the father of the computer. He was a Bible-believing scientist. The field of dynamics, founded by Isaac Newton, a Bible-believing scientist. The field of energetics, founded by Lord Kelvin. We still use his name in temperature readings. Degrees Kelvin, it's still used today. Gave his name to that whole field. Galactic astronomy, William Herschel, Bible-believing scientist. The field of genetics, the founder, everybody recognizes, Gregor Mendel. He was a Catholic monk, and he's the founder of the field of genetics. Glacial geology, that's Louis Agassiz again. Hydraulics, that's Leonardo da Vinci, a Bible-believing scientist. Ichthyology, the study of fish, again, that's Louis Agassiz. Isotopic chemistry, William Ramsay. Physical astronomy, again, that's Johannes Kepler. Systematic biology, Carolus Linnaeus, still gives his name to the way in which living beings are categorized, the Linnaean system. He's the founder of systematic biology, Bible-believing scientist. The field of thermodynamics, that's again Lord Kelvin. Vertebrate paleontology, Georges Cuvier. So obviously history makes it very clear that there is simply no conflict between being a good scientist and believing in a biblical view of origins. For instance, Johannes Kepler, he's the one, as the founder of physical astronomy, discovered the laws of planetary motion, and he said this, that when he was doing his astronomical researches, he was merely, quote, thinking God's thoughts after him. This is the guy that founded the field of astronomy. He said this in one of his books, and he believed the world was created 7,000 years ago, just as you and I do. Kepler, quote, since we astronomers are priests of the highest God in regard to the book of nature, it befits us to be thoughtful not of the glory of our minds, but rather above all else of the glory of God. Now here's Isaac Newton. Discovered the law of universal gravitation, formulated the 3 laws of motion, which make possible the discipline of dynamics and development of calculus, wrote books on biblical prophecy. He said this, we account the scriptures of God to be the most sublime philosophy. I find more sure marks of authenticity in the Bible than in any profane history whatsoever. You cannot have a conflict between good theology and good science. Stay with us. Back with Bradley Dean.